Today we'll be covering the anatomy and physiology of the respiratory system, as well as other systems that the respiratory system impacts and the importance of the respiratory system. We have the thoracic vertebrae T1 through T12. Each rib articulates with a thoracic vertebra, which provides an anchor point for rib movements during breathing. These joints allow the ribs to rotate and elevate during inspiration and return during expiration. There are 12 pairs of ribs that curve around the lungs to form the majority of the rib cage. The upper ribs mainly move in a pump handle motion, increasing the anterior-posterior diameter of the thorax. The lower ribs move in a bucket handle motion, increasing the lateral diameter. The costal cartilages, the flexible cartilage connecting the ribs to the sternum, allow the rib cage to stretch and recoil, which is essential for smooth breathing. The ribs articulate with the sternum, which is made up of the manubrium, the body, and the xiphoid process. The sternum acts as a central point where many ribs meet, and it rises slightly during inspiration as the ribs elevate. The trachea and bronchi have cartilage rings that prevent the airway from collapsing. Costal cartilage allows ribs to expand during inhalation. Connective tissue helps hold blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatics in place within the lungs. The diaphragm is the major muscle of inspiration and accounts for about 60 to 75% of the air drawn into the lungs during quiet breathing. It is a dome-shaped muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. It attaches to the xiphoid process, the inner surface of the lower six ribs, and the upper lumbar vertebrae via the crura. The second major group of primary inspiratory muscles is the external intercostals. These muscles fill the spaces between the ribs downward and forward from the rib above to the rib below. They help elevate the ribs and expand the rib cage. They increase both the anterior, posterior, and lateral dimensions of the thorax. Even though each individual muscle contributes a small amount, the combined action of all the external intercostals significantly increases thoracic volume during inspiration. The parasternal intercostals help move the upper ribs upward and outward, increasing the anterior-posterior diameter of the rib cage. They are fine-tuning the pump handle movement of the upper thorax. In forced breathing, these muscles can elevate the rib cage and expand the thorax. These help elevate and stabilize the shoulder girdle and ribs when breathing becomes labored. This originates from the sternum and clavicle and inserts on the mastoid process. When activated bilaterally, it helps elevate the sternum, increasing upper thoracic expansion. These three muscles originate from the cervical vertebrae and insert into the first two ribs. They stabilize and slightly elevate the first and second ribs during forced inspiration. These assist in lifting the ribs, especially during deep inspiration. The interosseous portion, the part between the ribs, acts as a true expiratory muscle. These fibers run downward and backward from the rib above to the rib below, the opposite direction of the external intercostals. When they contract, they pull the ribs downward and inward, decreasing the transverse dimensions of the rib cage. This increases the pressure inside the thoracic cavity and drives air out of the lungs. During speech, these muscles help stabilize and shape the rib cage so we can maintain a steady flow of air. The abdominal wall muscles push the diaphragm upwards and compress the abdominal cavity to decrease lung volume. The rectus abdominis is a long vertical muscle that flexes the trunk. When engaged, it pushes the abdominal contents up and against the diaphragm, reducing thoracic volume. The external oblique is the most superficial abdominal muscle running downward and inward. It compresses the abdomen and lowers the rib cage. The internal oblique lies just under the external oblique. Its fibers run perpendicular, which creates strong, multidirectional compression of the abdominal cavity. The transverse abdominis is the deepest abdominal muscle with horizontal fibers. It acts like a corset, providing the most direct compression of the abdominal contents and helping generate high internal pressures. Functionally, the abdominal muscles work together to push the diaphragm upward, decrease thoracic volume, regulate subglottal pressure during speech, and support sustained phonation and loudness. This helps pull the anterior ribs downward, which decreases the anterior-posterior diameter of the thorax. Even though it's not a powerful muscle, it contributes to forced expiration by tightening the chest wall and assisting in rib depression. It's especially active during coughing, blowing, or speech that requires rapid pressure modulation. This pulls the lower ribs downwards, assisting with the compression of the thorax. During inspiration, the diaphragm contracts and moves downward. At the same time, the external intercostal muscles lift the ribs upwards and outwards. These muscle actions increase the volume of the thoracic cavity. When the volume increases, the pressure inside the lungs decreases, and because air flows from areas of high pressure to low pressure, air naturally flows into the lungs. During exhalation, the process is usually more passive. The diaphragm relaxes and rises back up, and the ribs move downwards. This decreases the volume of the thoracic cavity. When volume decreases, pressure inside the lungs increases, which pushes air out. Exhalation can also be more active, like when we exercise or are speaking loudly. In active exhalation, the internal intercostals and the abdominal muscles contract to force air out more assertively. This entire process follows Boyle's law, which tells us that pressure and volume are inversely related. When one goes up, the other goes down. Next, we have the gas exchange. This happens in the alveoli, which are tiny air sacs surrounded by capillaries. Oxygen moves from the alveoli into the blood, and carbon dioxide moves from the blood into the alveoli. This exchange happens because of the concentration gradients. Each gas moves from where it's more concentrated to where it's less concentrated. And now for the neural control of breathing. Breathing is primarily regulated by the brainstem, specifically the medulla and the pons. The phrenic nerves send signals that make the diaphragm contract, and the intercostal nerves activate the external and internal intercostal muscles. Chemoreceptors in the body constantly monitor our internal environment. They detect carbon dioxide levels, which are the main driver of breathing, along with blood pH and oxygen levels. Based on this information, the brainstem automatically adjusts the rate and the depth of the breathing. We also have protective mechanisms that keep the respiratory system clean and safe. The mucus and tiny hair-like structures called cilia trap particles and move them out of the airway. Reflexes like coughing and sneezing also help remove irritants, and as air travels through the respiratory tract, it is warm, humidified, and filtered. For breathing to work efficiently, the lungs must also stretch easily during inspiration. This is called compliance. And then they also must recoil naturally during expiration. This depends on their elasticity.
Exhalation takes about 2 to 3 seconds. In speech, one big quick breath is taken, and then exhalation happens slowly while we're speaking. While swallowing, breathing is briefly paused so to avoid foreign bodies making their way down the esophagus and into the lungs.
When we inhale, oxygen enters the alveoli in our lungs. Capillaries surround the alveoli, allowing oxygen to pass into the blood. At the same time, carbon dioxide from the blood moves into the alveoli to be exhaled. Oxygen binds to hemoglobin in red blood cells and is transported through the circulatory system to tissues and organs. The oxygen fuels cellular processes, especially energy production in cells. As cells use oxygen, they produce carbon dioxide as a waste product. The circulatory system carries this carbon dioxide back to the lungs where it is removed from the body during exhalation.
The respiratory system feeds the muscular system with the oxygen that it needs to undergo cellular respiration.
The primary function of the respiratory system is obviously to sustain human life. The basic needs of human life will always be prioritized over both speech and swallowing. And now, our questions for you. How does increased thoracic volume relate to speech loudness? And why is exhaling immediately after swallow considered protective?